Welcome to the quietest corner of the village. We knew you'd find us eventually.
Chapter 1. The Disadvantage of Fascinators in High Winds. Agatha Raisin was currently experiencing the three things she hated most in the world: the countryside in damp weather, being seated at the overflow table, and a creeping, dreadful sense of her own irrelevance. She stood on the soggy lawn of Castley Manor, her furiously expensive Italian heels sinking an inch into the mud with every step. The occasion was the wedding reception of the season. Clarissa Montgomery, daughter of the local magistrate, was marrying a devastatingly dull banker from London. Agatha, as a relatively new but financially prominent fixture in the village, had naturally secured an invitation. What she had not secured was a date. Worse, she had been seated at table 14 during the breakfast. Table 14 was situated directly next to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen, populated entirely by deaf great-aunts and a bachelor cousin who had spent 40 minutes explaining the mating habits of the common woodlouse. Agatha, who had spent the better part of 2 hours perfectly applying her makeup and wrestling her unruly brown hair into a sleek, youthful style, felt profoundly insulted. "I should have stayed in London," Agatha muttered to herself, swatting away a stray raindrop that threatened the structural integrity of her peacock feather fascinator. "I could be at a cocktail bar in Mayfair. Instead, I'm getting trench foot for a girl who once asked if my PR agency handled agricultural feed." She grabbed a flute of lukewarm champagne from a passing waiter, scowling at the glittering crowd assembled beneath the massive white marquee. Everyone who was anyone in the Cotswolds was here, wearing pastel silks and tailored morning suits, looking effortlessly aristocratic and horribly smug. Agatha smoothed down the front of her tailored emerald green dress, suddenly feeling that the plunging neckline was perhaps a bit too metropolitan for a Saturday afternoon in Gloucestershire. She felt a sharp, familiar pang of loneliness, the kind she usually drowned in a gin and tonic or a frozen dinner. "You look as though you're planning a murder, Agatha," a mild voice said beside her. Agatha turned to see Mrs. Bloxby, the vicar's wife, looking as serene as ever in a sensible floral two-piece that Agatha wouldn't have been caught dead in. "I'm planning several," Agatha snapped, though she softened slightly. She liked Mrs. Bloxby, who possessed a rare talent for seeing through Agatha's abrasive shell without making a fuss about it. "Starting with whoever placed me next to cousin Hubert. I now know more about the digestive tract of an isopod than any sane woman should." Mrs. Bloxby offered a sympathetic smile. "It's a very large guest list." I'm sure Clarissa meant no offence. She's been in such a state all morning. Apparently the seating chart was a nightmare to arrange. "Well, she ought to have hired a professional," Agatha said haughtily, draining her champagne. "In my PR days, if I'd seated a premier guest by the kitchen, I'd have been sacked." She was about to expand on her former glories in London, a habit she leaned into whenever she felt socially insecure, when a sharp, piercing scream shattered the gentle hum of polite conversation. The sound came from the direction of the manor's conservatory, a glass-walled extension being used to display the towering 5-tier wedding cake and the mountain of expensive gifts. For a fraction of a second, the marquee went dead silent. Then the orchestra awkwardly stopped playing, a cello letting out a dying groan. Agatha didn't hesitate. Before her brain could remind her that she was wearing 4-inch heels in wet grass, her PR instincts and her insatiable, incurable nosiness kicked in. She abandoned her empty glass on a nearby trellis and marched briskly toward the conservatory, shoving past a cluster of bewildered aristocrats. "Excuse me, coming through, make way," Agatha barked, using the exact tone she used to employ to part the paparazzi outside London nightclubs. She reached the conservatory doors just ahead of the bride's father, Lord Montgomery. Inside, a young bridesmaid in a peach taffeta monstrosity was backed against the gift table, her hands over her mouth, hyperventilating. Agatha pushed the doors open. The air inside smelled cloyingly of royal icing, lilies, and something sharp and metallic. Sprawled on the imported marble floor, partially hidden behind a table laden with crystal decanters and silver toasters, lay a man. He was dressed impeccably in a charcoal morning suit, a pale blue silk tie knotted perfectly at his throat. His silver hair was neatly slicked back, and his manicured hands were thrown outward, as if he had tried to break his fall. But it was his face that made Agatha stop in her tracks. His skin was tinged a terrifying shade of blue, his eyes bulging sightlessly toward the glass ceiling, lips drawn back in a rigid, agonizing grimace. Agatha stared. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, just a perfectly dressed corpse beside a wedding cake. Good God, Lord Montgomery gasped, stumbling in behind her and clutching his chest. Clarissa, the bride, appeared moments later, letting out a theatrical shriek before collapsing into the arms of her new husband. The polite village murmurs outside erupted into a frantic buzzing. Agatha, however, felt a sudden, inappropriate thrill jolt through her veins. The humiliation of table 14 vanished entirely. Her boredom evaporated. 10 minutes later, the wail of police sirens cut through the rolling Cotswold hills. The local constabulary, led by the perpetually exasperated Detective Inspector Wilkes and Agatha's young friend, Police Constable Bill Wong, descended upon the manor. Guests were herded back into the marquee, whispering frantically, while the conservatory was cordoned off. Agatha, naturally, had refused to move further than the terrace doors, claiming she needed the fresh air for a sudden bout of faintness, a lie she delivered with terrible acting but sheer stubbornness. She watched as Inspector Wilkes, a man who always looked as though he had just bitten into a sour apple, approached the weeping bridal party. "Right," Wilkes said gruffly, flipping open a heavily abused notebook. "I'm sorry to interrupt the festivities, but I need an identification. Who is the deceased? A relative? A friend of the groom?" Clarissa, dabbing her eyes carefully so as not to ruin her mascara, sniffled and looked at her new husband. The groom looked at Lord Montgomery. Lord Montgomery looked bewildered. "Inspector," Lord Montgomery said, his voice trembling slightly, "we don't know." Wilkes paused, his pen hovering. "I'm sorry, we don't know who he is." The bridegroom chimed in, sounding defensive. "I've never seen him before in my life." "Neither have I," Clarissa added. "He wasn't at the ceremony. I thought he was one of Arthur's banking friends." "Well, he's not," Arthur snapped. Inspector Wilkes frowned, looking from the furious groom to the baffled father of the bride. "You're telling me an entirely unknown man just wandered into the most exclusive wedding of the year, dressed to the nines, and dropped dead next to your cake?" Agatha, hovering by the door, leaned in closer, her dark eyes gleaming. An uninvited guest. A perfect suit. No identification. Oh, Agatha thought, a genuine smile spreading across her lips for the first time all day. This is going to be far more interesting than Woodless. Chapter 2. The Art of Polite. Lying the interior of the wedding marquee had transformed from a scene of forced countryside elegance into a humid, buzzing hive of scandal. The rain drummed relentlessly against the white canvas roof, trapping the scent of damp wool, expensive perfume, and nervous perspiration. Guests who, only an hour prior, had been stifling yawns over overcooked pheasant were now vibrating with poorly concealed excitement. Agatha Raisin stood near the chocolate fountain, pretending to examine a skewered strawberry while actually employing the eavesdropping skills that had once made her the most feared PR executive in London. "I heard it was a massive heart attack," whispered Mrs. Partridge, the president of the Castley Ladies' Society, her eyes gleaming with morbid delight. "Though with that shade of blue one can't completely rule out poison. I saw a fascinating documentary about cyanide just last Tuesday." "Don't be absolutely absurd, Margaret," hissed her companion, a retired colonel with a bristling moustache. The man was a Gaelic-crasher, probably a common thief after the silver toasters. Agatha popped the strawberry into her mouth, chewing thoughtfully. A common thief, nonsense. The man's suit had been Savile Row, or at least a staggeringly good imitation, and his shoes were Italian leather. Thieves did not dress better than the father of the bride unless they were in a Hollywood film. No, this man belonged here, or at least he thought he did. She smoothed down the front of her emerald dress, adjusting her neckline, and marched purposefully toward the front of the marquee, where the immediate families were huddled in a tight defensive circle. Clarissa, the bride, was currently draped over a gilded Chiavari chair, sipping a glass of brandy and looking remarkably photogenic for a woman who had just tripped over a corpse. Agatha sidled up to Mrs. Gable Smith, the groom's spectacularly snobbish mother, who was currently fanning herself with a stiff linen napkin. "Dreadful business," Agatha declared loudly, bypassing any polite preamble. "Simply dreadful, though I suppose it spices up the afternoon. Do you often have anonymous men dropping dead at family functions? Or is this a special treat just for the bride?" Mrs. Gable Smith bristled, her pale, watery eyes narrowing at Agatha. "I beg your pardon, Mrs. Raisin. We are all in a state of profound shock. Arthur has absolutely no idea who that vagrant was." "Vagrant?" Agatha raised a skeptical, perfectly arched eyebrow. "He was wearing a three-piece charcoal suit and a silk tie. If that's a vagrant, I'd hate to see your definition of middle class." "He was a stranger, Mrs. Gable," Smith snapped, her voice rising an entire octave, an ugly red flush creeping up her neck. "He certainly wasn't on our side of the guest list. I meticulously curated our invitations. He must be some unsavory business acquaintance of Clarissa's father." Agatha's dark eyes darted instantly to the woman's hands. Mrs. Gable Smith was twisting her diamond wedding band so violently, her knuckle was turning white. "She's lying," Agatha thought with a sudden triumphant jolt. "Or she knows something she isn't saying." Before Agatha could ruthlessly press the issue, a heavy hand descended on her shoulder. "Agatha," a familiar, weary voice said. She turned to face police Constable Bill Wong, whose broad, youthful face was drawn into a severe frown. Bill was one of the few people in Castle Agatha actually considered a genuine friend, though right now he represented an immensely irritating obstacle. "Hello, Bill," Agatha said brightly. "Have you found out who he is yet? Check his pockets." "A man with a haircut that sharp always carries a business card." "We are handling it, Agatha," Bill said gently, but firmly steering her by the elbow away from the glaring Mrs. Gable Smith, and by we, I mean the police. "Inspector Wilkes is already having an absolute fit because you were the first one inches the conservatory. He specifically asked me to make sure you stay out of the way." "I am merely offering my condolences," Agatha sniffed, pulling her arm free with a haughty jerk. "You were interrogating the groom's mother," Bill sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Please just go home. The party is over. We're taking statements. But since you didn't see him go in, you can't help." "I most certainly can," Agatha retorted, her pride stinging sharply. "Nobody in this village tells the truth, Bill. You know that perfectly well. They'd rather cover up a murder than admit they bought a dress off the rack. That woman knows who he is. Agatha, go home." Bill's tone brooked no argument. Muttering darkly about ungrateful, small-minded policemen, Agatha turned on her heel and stomped toward the marquee exit, her stilettos sinking dangerously into the sodden grass matting. She had every intention of marching to her car, driving back to her pristine cottage, and pouring herself a very large glass of gin. But as she reached the edge of the tent, she paused to shake a clump of mud from her shoe. Through a gap in the canvas, she had a clear view of the caterer's van parked near the tradesman's entrance. Standing behind it, desperately puffing on a cigarette, was the peach taffeta-clad bridesmaid who had originally discovered the body. The girl was shaking like a leaf in the wind, tears streaming, ruining her makeup, and she was furiously tapping out a text message on her phone, her eyes darting around in sheer panic. Agatha froze, the cold Cotswold rain suddenly forgotten. People who stumbled upon random strangers didn't cry like their hearts were completely broken. They didn't hide behind vans looking terrified of being caught. The mysterious dead man in the conservatory wasn't a stranger at all. Agatha smiled grimly, her vanity and irritation entirely replaced by the thrilling, undeniable pull of a fresh mystery. She wasn't going home. Not a chance. Chapter 3. The Cottage, the Cat, and the Clue. Agatha's sleek, red car bounced down the narrow, winding lanes of Castle like an angry beetle. She drove with a ferocious intensity, gripping the steering wheel as if it were the neck of Inspector Wilkes. By the time she pulled into her gravel driveway, her mood was a toxic mixture of bruised pride, lingering champagne, and absolute stubborn curiosity. She slammed the car door, ignoring the rain that had finally turned into a steady, miserable drizzle. Her 4-inch heels clicked a bitter rhythm on the flagstones as she marched up to her front door, unlocked it with a sharp twist of her brass key, and stepped inside her immaculate, painfully quiet cottage. "Hodge, Boswell," she called out, though she knew her too fat, indifferent cats rarely greeted her at the door unless a tin of tuna was actively being popped. A heavy silence answered her. She kicked off her ruined Italian shoes, abandoning them by the umbrella stand with a silent promise to send them to the dry cleaner, and stalked straight to the kitchen. Her gaze locked immediately onto the landline phone resting on the counter. Beside it sat her mobile phone, currently devoid of any messages from anyone important. "Nobody tells me anything," she muttered, yanking the cork out of a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc with a vicious pop. She didn't bother looking for a wine glass. She grabbed a ceramic mug decorated with a picture of a rather haughty-looking spaniel and poured a generous, unmeasured river of white wine into it. She took a long, defensive gulp, letting the cold, crisp liquid burn away the lingering chill of the Carsley Manor lawn. Agatha dropped onto her plush sofa, pulling her knees up and resting her chin in her hand. Her mind drifted back to the wedding, the dead man in the charcoal suit, the bride's mother twisting her diamond ring until her skin went white, the groom's mother looking like she had swallowed a live wasp when Agatha mentioned his wardrobe, and, most importantly, the sobbing bridesmaid hiding behind the caterer's van, frantically typing a text message as if her life depended on it. She knew him, Agatha thought, narrowing her eyes at the blank television screen across the room. Or she knew someone who knew him. You don't weep hysterically over a total stranger unless you've got a heart of pure marshmallow, and nobody in the Cotswolds is that soft. Agatha took another gulp from her spaniel mug. The village of Carsley prided itself on its picturesque charm, its tight-knit community spirit, and its suffocatingly polite exterior. But Agatha knew better than anyone that beneath the manicured hedges and quaint thatched roofs, every household was practically swimming in dark little secrets, financial desperation, and petty malice. That was why she loved it, even when she hated it. It was like a soap opera where she didn't have to pay for the script. She stood up abruptly, pacing across her Persian rug. She couldn't just sit here. Wilkes and his dim-witted team would completely bungle the investigation. They would probably rule it a heart attack. After all, the man had turned blue, and sweep the whole thing under the rug so Lord Montgomery wouldn't have to deal with the bad publicity for his precious daughter's wedding album. "Not on my watch," Agatha declared to an empty room. She grabbed her phone, scrolled through her contacts, and tapped out a quick commanding text message to Bill Wong. "If you've arrested the wrong person or covered up a murder for the gentry, I will make sure the Daily Mail hears about it. Drop a hint. Who was the dead man?" She hit send, grinning with malicious satisfaction. She knew Bill wouldn't spill departmental secrets. He was far too honest for that, but he was young, impressionable, and secretly terrified of Agatha's tongue. Even a vague, non-committal reply would give her a thread to pull. Before Bill could reply, a sharp knock sounded at her front door. Agatha froze. For a wild, hopeful second, she wondered if James Lacey, her maddeningly aloof, handsome retired military neighbor who lived down the lane, had somehow heard about her distress and come to check on her. Her heart gave a treacherous little flutter. She rushed to the hallway mirror, quickly smoothed down her hair, licked her finger to tame a stray eyebrow, and threw open the door with what she hoped was a devastatingly glamorous expression. It wasn't James, standing on her porch, shivering under a tiny, pathetic polka-dot umbrella. Was the crying bridesmaid from the wedding. Her peach taffeta dress was stained with mud at the hem. Her fake eyelashes were hanging loose, like wounded spiders, and her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy. "Mrs. Raisin," the girl choked out, her voice trembling violently. Can I please come in? I saw your car pull up. You're the only person in this awful village who isn't terrified of Lord Montgomery." Agatha stared at her for a fraction of a second, processing the unexpected gift dropped directly onto her doorstep. The universe, it seemed, had a wonderful sense of humor after all. "Well," Agatha said, stepping aside and sweeping her arm outward in a grand, theatrical gesture, "don't just stand there letting your mascara run into your shoes. Come inside and tell me everything. Chapter 4. Tears, taffeta, and terrible confessions. The girl practically collapsed onto Agatha's plush velvet sofa, curling her legs up and immediately dissolving into a fresh, messy torrent of tears. She clutched a floral throw pillow to her chest, as if it were a life raft in a stormy sea. Agatha watched her for a moment with a mixture of clinical detachment and sudden, unexpected maternal instinct. She walked over to her small bar cart, bypassing the gin entirely, and poured a generous splash of brandy into a crystal tumbler. "Drink this," Agatha commanded, handing the glass to the girl with the practiced authority of a woman who had handled many a hysterical junior account executive in her London PR days. "It tastes like floor polish, but it stops the shaking." The girl sniffled, wiped her nose with the back of a damp hand, and took a cautious sip. She coughed, gasping slightly, but the colour quickly rushed back into her pale cheeks. "Thank you, Mrs. Raisin," she whispered, her voice cracking. I'm Chloe Davies. I was Clarissa's second cousin on her mother's side, and her chief bridesmaid, though right now I feel like I'm starring in a Greek tragedy." "Well, Chloe, you certainly made an impression during the appetizers," Agatha said dryly, settling into a matching armchair opposite her. She crossed her legs, leaning forward with an intensity that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "Now, before Inspector Wilkes finds out you've skipped the police interviews and comes pounding on my door with a warrant, you are going to tell me what a terrified bridesmaid was doing, hiding behind a caterer's van, and why you looked like you'd just seen a ghost, long before anyone even opened the conservatory doors." Chloe shrank back into the cushions, her eyes wide and panicked. "I didn't mean to. I swear, I didn't touch him." Agatha's eyes narrowed. "Touch who?" "The dead man." "Yes." Chloe burst into fresh tears, nearly sloshing her brandy. Julian Vance." Agatha filed the name away instantly, her brain working like a high-speed computer. Julian Vance. It sounded expensive, sharp, and entirely metropolitan, not a village name at all. "So you did know him," Agatha pressed softly, modulating her voice to sound less like an inquisitor and more like a sympathetic aunt, a trick she had learned in her darkest PR crises. The groom and Lord Montgomery swore up and down they'd never laid eyes on the man. "But you knew him, didn't you, Chloe? Who was he?" Chloe looked around Agatha's cozy cottage as if searching for a hidden exit, before slumping forward, her shoulders shaking. "He wasn't supposed to be here. He told me he was crashing the wedding to deliver an ultimatum. He said if Clarissa didn't leave Arthur at the altar, he'd expose the whole rotten mess." Agatha raised an eyebrow, her posture straightening. "An ultimatum? What rotten mess? Financial ruin?" Chloe whispered, glancing nervously at the window as if the local constabulary might materialize on the lawn. "Lord Montgomery is completely broke. The estate, the manor, the horses, it's all mortgaged up to the eyeballs. Arthur's family, the Gable Smiths, are fabulously wealthy, but they demanded a massive settlement and proof of aristocratic pedigree before they'd let Arthur marry Clarissa." Julian was Clarissa's secret fiancé from London, an art dealer, or a consultant, something with money. But when Lord Montgomery lost his fortune, Julian dropped her like a hot potato to marry an heiress in Chelsea. Only a month ago, Julian found out Clarissa managed to hook Arthur. He came here today to blackmail them both. He wanted £50,000 to keep his mouth shut about their past engagement, or he'd ruin the wedding publicly. Agatha absorbed this information with a slow, predatory grin. A blackmail plot. A desperate, broke aristocracy. A greedy ex-fiancé who pushed his luck too far. It was deliciously scandalous. The kind of story that would have dominated the front pages of the tabloids back when Agatha still cared about such things. "And you found him," Agatha prompted gently, "in the conservatory." "I went looking for him," Chloe cried, wringing her hands. "He told me to meet him by the gift table before the ceremony so I could hand over my savings. I was stupid. I gave him my inheritance bond last week to help him out of a debt, and when I walked in there, he was already turning blue. He was gasping. He grabbed my wrist so hard he bruised it, tried to say something, and then just collapsed. He was dead before he hit the marble." Agatha leaned forward, her dark eyes glittering with absolute focus. "Did he drink anything? Eat anything?" Just a glass of champagne, Chloe choked out. A waiter handed it to him right as he walked through the side terrace doors. Julian complained that it tasted bitter, like almonds, but he drank it anyway because he thought it was expensive. Almonds. Agatha's heart skipped a beat. Cyanide. The retired colonel's ridiculous documentary had actually been right. Before Agatha could ask another question, a loud, aggressive pounding echoed from her front door, rattling the glass in its frame. "Mrs. Raisin, open up. We know you're in there," Inspector Wilkes's voice bellowed from the porch, dripping with venom and authority. Chloe let out a terrified shriek, spilling the remainder of her brandy onto Agatha's pristine Persian rug. Agatha didn't even blink at the stain. Instead, a fierce, competitive spark lit up her eyes. She stood up smoothly, smoothing her skirt, and turned to the trembling girl. "Stay right here, Chloe," Agatha whispered, a confident, wicked smile playing on her lips. "Let the police bang on the door. We have a murderer to catch, and I'll be damned if Wilkes solves this before I do." Chapter 5. The bitter taste of almonds. The aggressive pounding on Agatha's front door rattled the brass knocker once more, followed by Inspector Wilkes's irritated voice calling out, "Mrs. Raisin, open this door immediately. I have reason to believe you are harboring a material witness." Chloe looked as though she might actually faint this time, her hands clutching the floral throw pillow so tightly her knuckles turned entirely white. "He's going to arrest me," she whimpered, her voice trembling on the verge of a full panic attack. "He'll think I did it because of the money I gave Julian. Oh, why did I ever come here?" "Pull yourself together, girl," Agatha snapped, though her tone was remarkably devoid of its usual venom. She walked over to the hallway mirror, gave her hair a quick, defiant pat, and strode toward the door. Inspector Wilkes couldn't solve a jigsaw puzzle if all the pieces were the same color. "Just stay out of sight in the kitchen, keep quiet, and don't touch my gin." Without waiting for Chloe to scramble off the sofa, Agatha whipped the front door open with a dramatic flourish. Inspector Wilkes stood on the porch, flanked by a perpetually sweating constable, Bill Wong. Wilkes looked like a thundercloud about to burst, his face flushed a deep, mottled red that clashed violently with his navy uniform. "Well?" Agatha demanded, crossing her arms defensively and leaning against the doorframe. "Is this a social call, Inspector, or are you just here to ruin my flooring with your muddy boots? Because if it's the latter, you can turn right back around." Wilkes scowled, his mustache twitching with suppressed rage. "Don't play games with me, Agatha. We know Chloe Davies, the chief bridesmaid, went missing from the manor right after we started taking statements. One of the catering staff saw her speeding away in a red hatchback that matches yours. Open the door. I'm searching the premises. My car is right out in the driveway. Inspector, take a look. It's clean as a whistle, and I haven't moved an inch since I left the reception in disgust." Agatha lied smoothly, batting her eyelashes with exaggerated innocence. "As for Miss Davies, I haven't the faintest idea where she is. Perhaps she ran off to elope with a better guest than the one who dropped dead." Before Wilkes could push past her, Bill Wong stepped forward, his eyes darting past Agatha into the dimly lit hallway. Bill's expression was a mix of mild anxiety and reluctant suspicion. "Agatha, be serious. This is a murder investigation now. The post-mortem preliminary results just came through from the county coroner. It wasn't a heart attack." Agatha raised an eyebrow, though her heart did a tiny triumphant flip-flop in her chest. "Oh, do enlighten me, Bill. Though considering your boss's track record, I assume you're going to tell me he died of acute bad taste." "Poison," Bill said quietly, lowering his voice. "Potassium cyanide, administered orally. The coroner found traces of it in a champagne glass recovered near the conservatory. Someone slipped it to him right before he collapsed." Wilkes shoved his way past Agatha into the hallway, ignoring her indignant gasp. "And since you were the very first person on the scene, or rather practically standing over the body like a vulture, I want to know what you know. You've been poking around every wedding guest with a magnifying glass all afternoon." "I was looking for a decent glass of champagne, which was entirely absent from table 14. "Thank you very much," Agatha shot back, following him into the living room. She deliberately positioned herself in front of the kitchen door, hoping Chloe was smart enough to stay out of sight. Wilkes surveyed the room, his sharp eyes scanning the Persian rug where a dark spreading stain of spilled brandy was rapidly drying. He paused, sniffing the air. "What's that smell?" "Brandy," Agatha said coolly, lifting her chin. "I dropped a glass. Living alone makes one clumsy, Inspector, especially when harassed by local law enforcement." Wilkes didn't look convinced, but he didn't see anyone hiding either. He turned back to Agatha, his expression hardening. "Listen to me, Agatha Raisin. This is a homicide. A man was murdered in cold blood at a public gathering. If you are withholding any information, any gossip, or any clues you think you've uncovered in your little amateur sleuthing games, I will haul you down to the station for obstruction of justice. Do I make myself clear?" "Crystal," Agatha replied, her smile razor sharp. "Though I should think you'd be thanking me. After all, if it weren't for me, you'd probably be ruling this an accidental death by bad neckwear." Wilkes turned on his heel, his face turning an even deeper shade of purple. "Come on, Bill. We're tearing this village apart until we find that bridesmaid. And you, Mrs. Raisin, stay out of this." With a heavy slam of the front door, the police officers marched off the porch, their car doors slamming, shut a moment later before the vehicle roared down the gravel drive. Agatha let out a long, shaky breath, her facade of cool confidence slipping just a fraction as she leaned back against the wall. She waited a full minute to ensure they weren't turning around, then pushed open the kitchen door. Chloe was sitting at the little wooden breakfast table, burying her face in her hands, trembling uncontrollably. Did they hear me?" Chloe whispered. "No," Agatha said softly, walking over to the kettle and switching it on. For all her sharp tongue and stubborn pride, a wave of genuine sympathy washed over her. She knew what it felt like to be cornered, desperate, and utterly alone. She set a mug of hot tea down in front of the girl. "Cyanide," Agatha murmured to herself, pulling out a chair and sitting down opposite Chloe. "Slip into a glass of champagne." Tasted bitter, like almonds. Chloe looked up, her red-rimmed eyes wide. "What does that mean?" "It means Julian didn't just wander into that wedding to collect £50,000 and walk out," Agatha said, her dark eyes narrowing with grim resolve. "Someone paid him off permanently. Someone who knew about the blackmail and knew that as long as Julian was breathing, their secrets weren't safe." Agatha took a sip of her own tea, her PR instincts fully awakening into a brilliant, dangerous focus. "Finish your tea, Chloe," Agatha commanded, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. "Tomorrow morning, we are going to pay a very polite, very devastating visit to the groom's mother. It's time to see what Mrs. Gable Smith has to hide." Chapter 6: Morning Calls and Stained Reputations. The morning sun broke over the Cotswolds with an irritating postcard perfect cheerfulness that entirely failed to match Agatha's dark, conspiratorial mood. She stood before her bedroom mirror, ruthlessly smoothing down a navy blue Chanel style blazer that screamed metropolitan money and quiet intimidation. Her hair was swept back into a sleek, unforgiving twist, and her makeup was applied with the precision of a woman preparing for war. Across the hall, Chloe Davies was still asleep on the guest room sofa bed, exhausted by a night of restless crying and nervous pacing. Agatha had left strict instructions: stay put, lock the doors, and don't answer to anyone except me or a cat. Agatha grabbed her leather handbag, checked to ensure her car keys and a small packet of mints were inside, and marched out to her red car. Her destination was the Larches, a sprawling, aggressively manicured estate on the outskirts of Carsley owned by Arthur's mother, the formidable Mrs. Gable Smith. If anyone in this village had the cold-blooded motive, the aristocratic arrogance, and the financial means to orchestrate a murder by potassium cyanide, it was the woman who viewed human beings primarily through the lens of pedigree charts. 10 minutes later, Agatha pulled her car up the long gravel driveway of the Larches. The estate looked like an illustration from a luxury lifestyle magazine. Immaculate topiary hedges, sweeping lawns, and a pristine white Georgian facade that practically radiated generational wealth. Agatha parked with a sharp crunch of gravel, stepped out, and strode toward the heavy oak front door. She didn't bother admiring the hydrangeas. She lifted the polished brass knocker, and let it fall 3 times with a resonant, authoritative crash. It took a moment, but the door was eventually opened by a severe-looking housekeeper in a crisp black dress whose expression suggested she had recently swallowed a lemon. "Good morning," Agatha said, pushing past the woman before she could utter a single syllable of protest. "I'm here to see Mrs. Gable. Smith. Tell her Mrs. Raisin is calling. It's regarding yesterday's unfortunate catering mishap." "Mrs. Gable, Smith is not receiving visitors," the housekeeper stammered, backing up as Agatha swept into the high-ceilinged marble foyer like an invading army. "The family is in a state of profound distress following—" "Nonsense," Agatha interrupted loudly, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "Everyone in Carsley is in a state of distress, and I prefer mine dealt with over a cup of proper coffee." Before the housekeeper could summon the gardener to throw her out, a door to the left swung open. Mrs. Gable. Smith stepped into the hallway. She was wearing a cream silk blouse and tailored trousers, though her normally immaculate hair was slightly disheveled, and dark circles bruised the skin beneath her watery eyes. She looked less like a triumphant mother of the groom, and more like a woman whose fortress was slowly crumbling around her. "What is the meaning of this?" "Mrs. Gable," Smith snapped, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed fury. "How dare you waltz into my home, uninvited? Mrs. Raisin, get out before I call Inspector Wilkes." "Oh, please do call him," Agatha replied sweetly, stepping closer and closing the distance between them with predatory grace. "In fact, I just left him a little note this morning, suggesting he look into your financial disclosures. He's so delightfully dim, he might even check your bank statements by Tuesday." "Mrs. Gable," Smith's face drained of what little colour it had left. She gripped the edge of a mahogany side table, so hard, her knuckles turned chalk white. "You wouldn't try me," Agatha whispered, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial hiss. "I used to handle PR crises for politicians and corporate moguls who embezzled millions. A provincial snob hiding a dead blackmailer is practically light reading for me." The older woman's breath hitched. She looked around the empty hallway, swallowed hard, and gestured stiffly toward a sunlit morning room overlooking the gardens. "In here now." Agatha followed her into a room filled with expensive antiques, white linen sofas, and the faint melancholic scent of dried lavender. "Mrs. Gable," Smith sank into an armchair, looking suddenly 10 years older, all the haughty armor she had worn at the wedding reception entirely stripped away. "What do you want, Agatha?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Let's start with Julian Vance," Agatha said, taking a seat opposite her without waiting for an invitation. She crossed her legs, looking every bit the ruthless inquisitor. "The handsome man in the charcoal suit, who drank poisoned champagne in the conservatory. You knew him, didn't you? And don't bother lying. I know about the blackmail." Mrs. Gable Smith closed her eyes, pressing a trembling hand to her forehead. "I didn't kill him, I swear to you, I didn't. You had a motive." Agatha pressed relentlessly. "Lord Montgomery was broke, your son Arthur was marrying into a debt-ridden family, and Julian was threatening to blow the whole sham marriage apart by revealing Clarissa's past attachments and financial desperation unless he was paid off. £50,000, wasn't it?" "75, Mrs. Gable," Smith corrected bitterly, opening her eyes. A fierce, resentful spark flashed in them. "The man was a leech, a professional parasite. For 6 months he's been bleeding Lord Montgomery dry, and when Montgomery ran out of funds, Julian turned his sights on us. He threatened to ruin Arthur's wedding on national papers if we didn't settle Montgomery's debts through the marriage settlement." "So you paid him off," Agatha deduced smoothly. "You agreed to meet him at the wedding yesterday, but instead of handing over a check, you slipped potassium cyanide into his champagne." "No, Mrs. Gable," Smith cried out, leaning forward, genuine terror in her eyes. "I did agree to meet him. I went into the conservatory just before the ceremony with the cashier's check in my handbag. I wanted to buy him off and get him out of our lives forever. But when I got in there, he was already standing by the gift table, holding a glass of champagne someone else had handed him. He told me he had another copy of the letters in a safety deposit box, and that 50,000 wouldn't cut it anymore. He wanted a permanent allowance." Agatha studied her intently, searching for any flicker of deceit in the older woman's tense posture. And then he took a sip of his drink, Mrs. Gable, Smith whispered, her voice shaking violently. He choked, dropped the glass, and grabbed my arm so hard he bruised it before he fell. I panicked. I had a check for £75,000 in my bag, and a dead blackmailer at my feet. If the police found out why he was there, Arthur's wedding would have been destroyed, our reputation dragged through the mud, and everyone in the county would have laughed at us. So you ran away like a coward, Agatha said bluntly. I hid the check and I left. Gable Smith admitted, tears finally spilling over her lashes. I didn't poison him, Agatha. I swear to you on my son's life. Someone else wanted Julian dead, just as badly as I did. Or perhaps someone wanted to make sure he never talked at all. Agatha leaned back, her mind racing. Mrs. Gable, Smith was telling the truth about the panic, but her confession only deepened the web of secrets. If the groom's mother didn't kill him, and the bride's father was broke, who else in that village had a motive to silence Julian Vance permanently? Before Agatha could probe further, a sudden violent crash echoed from the front hallway, followed by the sound of shouting and shattering glass. Chapter 7. Shattered glass and second thoughts. The sharp, metallic crash from the hallway froze the air in the morning room. For a fraction of a second, Agatha and Mrs. Gable Smith sat paralyzed, the heavy scent of dried lavender suddenly feeling suffocating. Before Mrs. Gable Smith could find her voice, Agatha was already on her feet. Her PR instincts, owned by decades of dealing with chaotic press conferences and sudden scandals, surged forward. She didn't wait for an invitation. She strode past the white linen sofas and whipped open the morning room door. The grand marble foyer was a scene of absolute chaos. A massive, antique porcelain vase lay shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces across the polished stone floor. Its contents, a sprawling arrangement of water lilies and ferns, forming a soggy puddle. Standing in the center of the debris, breathing heavily and looking thoroughly bewildered, was none other than Arthur Gable Smith, the groom. He was still dressed in a rumpled shirt from the night before, his usually neat hair standing on end. In his hand he clutched a heavy brass poker he must have snatched from the study fireplace. Arthur, what on earth are you doing? Mrs. Gable Smith shrieked, rushing past Agatha and hurrying toward her son. Have you completely lost your mind? Smashing family heirlooms in the hallway. I heard shouting. Arthur panted, his eyes wide and bloodshot as he scanned the room. He looked past his mother and locked eyes with Agatha, his expression twisting into ugly panic and rage. What is she doing here? Why is Mrs. Raisin in our house? Is she talking to the police? Did she tell them? Calm down, Arthur, before you give yourself an aneurysm, Agatha said coolly, stepping out into the foyer and stepping carefully around a shard of porcelain. She folded her arms, casting a critical eye over the frantic groom. I wasn't talking to the police. I was having a delightful, highly revealing chat with your mother about blackmail, cyanide, and your family's desperate need for a cash injection. Arthur's face drained of color, the heavy brass poker trembling in his grip. You don't know anything. Oh, but I do, Agatha countered, her voice ringing with absolute haughty confidence. I know that Julian Vance was bleeding your future father-in-law dry. I know he came to your wedding to demand an extortionate payout to keep quiet about past secrets. And I know your mother was standing in that conservatory just minutes before he dropped dead. Arthur, put that ridiculous thing down this instant, Mrs. Gable Smith commanded, though her own hands were shaking as she patted her son's arm. She turned to Agatha, her tone turning venomous. You have no proof of anything, Mrs. Raisin. You are a meddling, nosy outsider who has no business poking around in family matters that do not concern you. A murder in our village concerns every single person who likes a quiet life. Agatha snapped back. She took a step closer, narrowing her dark eyes at Arthur. Though I suppose a dead blackmailer is terribly convenient for you, Arthur. No awkward past scandals to explain to your wealthy bride. No embarrassing debts dragging down your social standing. You get the girl, the money, and a tidy little burial all in one weekend. Arthur flinched, a flicker of genuine guilt crossing his face before he forced an angry scowl. "I was in the stables when Julian died. The best man and 3 other guests saw me checking on the horses. I didn't even know he was there until the screaming started. People can move very quickly when they have a mind to," Agatha murmured, her sharp mind turning over the pieces. She looked at mother and son standing together among the shattered porcelain, both desperate, both harbouring secrets, both terrified of exposure. Yet, looking at Arthur's trembling hands and sweaty brow, Agatha felt a sudden, nagging doubt. Arthur was weak, arrogant, and easily panicked, but murder by potassium cyanide required a cold, calculated nerve. It required a planner. Before Agatha could press them further, the distant wail of a police siren cut through the morning air, growing louder by the second as it raced up the long gravel driveway. "Mrs. Gable," Smith gasped, clutching her chest. "You called the police." "I did no such thing," Agatha said honestly, though she wasn't entirely unhappy about the timing. "Though it seems Inspector Wilkes has a sixth sense for when I'm about to uncover the truth. Get out," Arthur hissed, his panic boiling over as he gripped the brass poker again. "Get out of our house right now, or I'll have the constable throw you off the property for trespassing and harassment." Agatha looked at the furious groom, then at the shattered vase, and finally at the flashing blue lights reflecting through the frosted glass of the front door. Her pride stung at the interruption, but she knew when to tactically retreat. She had what she came for, confirmation of the blackmail, the mother's confession of being in the room, and enough tension to crack this case wide open. "Very well," Agatha said, offering a cool, condescending smile. She turned sharply on her heel, her tailored blazer swishing with motion. "Enjoy your morning, Arthur. Do try not to break any more expensive antiques. Dusting porcelain is such a bore." She swept out the front door just as Wilkes's squad car skidded to a halt on the gravel, nearly clipping her favorite red car. Ignoring the furious shouting of the inspector from behind her, Agatha climbed into her vehicle, slammed the door, and drove away with a triumphant grin. The pieces were coming together. But as she drove back toward Carsley, a cold realization settled into her stomach. The killer knew they were being hunted, and a cornered rat was a dangerous thing indeed. Chapter 8. A midnight meeting, and a second shadow. The sun dipped below the rolling Cotswold hills, casting long, bruised shadows across the manicured lawns of Carsley. By midnight, the village had settled into an eerie, deceptive stillness. Most residents were fast asleep, tucked safely behind double-glazed windows and heavy velvet curtains, blissfully unaware of the dark currents swirling beneath their polite facade. Agatha Raisin, however, was wide awake. She sat in the absolute dark of her living room, a wool blanket pulled tightly around her shoulders, staring out the front window. Her house was dead silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional soft purr of Hodge, who was curled up soundly on the sofa, utterly indifferent to murder investigations. Agatha's mind was a whirlwind of motion. She replayed every conversation, every twitch of Mrs. Gable Smith's hands, every panicked word from Chloe, and Arthur's frantic vase-smashing entrance at the Larches. Something was missing. A crucial puzzle piece was hiding just out of reach in the shadows. If Mrs. Gable Smith hadn't poisoned the champagne, and Arthur had supposedly been in the stables, who had actually slipped the potassium cyanide into Julian Vance's glass? And more importantly, how had the killer known the exact moment Julian would walk into the conservatory? A soft tap at her front window broke the silence. Agatha froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a sudden spike of adrenaline clearing away any lingering fatigue. She slipped off the sofa, quietly unwrapping the blanket, and crept toward the hallway. Another soft rap sounded, this time at the front door, accompanied by a low, urgent whisper. "Mrs. Raisin, please, it's me." Agatha squinted through the peephole. Standing on her porch, shivering under the pale moonlight, was not Inspector Wilkes, nor Arthur, nor even Chloe. It was the young, eager-eyed parish curate, Julian's Waite. No, the curate had nothing to do with it. It was young P.C. Bill Wong, out of uniform, wearing a dark hoodie and looking intensely nervous. Agatha unlocked the heavy deadbolt, pulled the door open, and yanked Bill inside by his sleeve before he could knock a third time. "Have you completely lost your mind creeping around people's houses at midnight?" Agatha hissed, shutting and locking the door firmly behind him. Do you have any idea how close I was to calling the neighborhood watch? I'm sorry, Agatha, Bill whispered, pulling off his hood and running a hand through his dark hair. He looked genuinely distressed. I shouldn't be here. If Wilkes finds out I'm leaking departmental notes to you, I'll be transferred to traffic duty in the bleakest corner of Gloucestershire before dawn. Then you'd better make it worth my while, Agatha said, crossing her arms as she led him into the dimly lit kitchen. She flicked on a small desk lamp, rather than the harsh overhead light, gesturing for him to sit at the small wooden table. What's happened? Have you arrested someone? No, Bill said, dropping into a chair and leaning forward. That's just it. We haven't arrested anyone, and Wilkes is about to close the case as an unsolved sudden death due to unknown toxic ingestion to save Lord Montgomery and the county magistrates from a massive public scandal. Agatha's eyes flashed with pure fury. They're sweeping it under the rug. A man was murdered with cyanide at a society wedding, and they're going to file it away like a bad parking ticket. Lord Montgomery's influence runs deep, Bill admitted miserably, and the coroner's secondary report came back. But it contained something Wilkes hasn't even noticed yet, or chose to ignore. Agatha leaned in closer across the table, her breath catching. What is it, Bill? The poison wasn't just in the champagne glass, Bill said quietly, his eyes wide. The lab tested the rim of the glass again. It wasn't slipped in by a waiter walking by, and it wasn't dropped in while Julian was standing there. Agatha's AR intuition clicked into high gear. Go on. The glass was pre-poisoned, Bill said. It was sitting on a tray of welcome drinks reserved specifically for the wedding party and VIPs near the private inner study doors, long before guests even entered the conservatory. Only someone with backstage access to the private quarters knew which glass Julian was going to pick up. Or rather, someone steered him toward that exact spot. Agatha went completely still, steered him. She remembered Chloe's trembling voice from yesterday. He told me to meet him by the gift table. A waiter handed him a glass of champagne, right as he walked through the side, terrace doors. Waiters don't randomly hand out specific drinks to random gatecrashers unless they are told to, or unless the person handing the drink wasn't a standard catering staff member at all, but someone blending seamlessly into the crowd, someone wearing the right clothes, smiling the right polite Cotswold smile. Bill, Agatha asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous icy whisper. Who hired the catering company for the wedding? Bill blinked, searching his memory. It was an agency out of Cheltenham, gourmet Cotswold fare, but the staffing manager noted that the bride's family insisted on bringing in one extra freelance server at the last minute, a local girl who needed work experience, or so they claimed. Who? Agatha demanded, her heart pounding with sudden, blinding clarity. A local girl, Bill frowned, trying to recall the name from the manifest. Let me check my notes. Before Bill could pull his notebook from his hoodie pocket, a sharp metallic sound echoed from the front of the house. Clink. It was the sound of a pebble hitting the front window glass. Agatha and Bill froze. Through the front window blinds, a dark silhouette flashed across the porch light, moving stealthily toward the side of the house, where the kitchen window looked out over the dark lane. Stay right here, Agatha whispered fiercely, her pride and courage instantly overriding her common sense. She grabbed a heavy brass, plated candle holder from the counter. Before Bill could stop her, Agatha marched to the back door, threw it open, and stepped out into the chilly midnight air, ready to confront whatever shadow was lurking in her garden. Chapter 9. The trap is set. The chill of the midnight Cotswold air hit Agatha like a physical blow, but she didn't hesitate. Gripping the heavy brass candle holder like a club, she rounded the corner of her cottage, her eyes scanning the dark, overgrown flower beds. I know you're out there, Agatha called out, her voice sharp and ringing with fierce indignation. You can slink around in the shadows all you like, but if you've broken my garden gnomes, I'll have your head on a spike. A rustle came from behind the large hydrangea bush near the back fence. A figure wrapped in a dark hooded raincoat darted backward, scrambling frantically toward the low wooden gate that led out to the lane. Hey, stop right there, PC Bill Wong shouted, bursting out the back door behind Agatha and giving chase with surprising agility for a man built like a rugby player. Bill vaulted across the lawn, but the intruder was already pulling the gate open. With a desperate shove, the figure slipped through into the dark lane beyond. By the time Bill reached the opening and flicked on his pocket flashlight, the beam cut through nothing but empty, misty road and the echoing crunch of hurried footsteps fading rapidly into the distance. "Damn it," Bill panted, lowering the flashlight as he turned back to Agatha, who had marched up beside him with the candle holder still raised. "They gone? Too fast. Did you see who it was?" "No," Agatha said, her breathing slightly elevated, though her eyes were narrowed with a cold, analytical fury. She lowered the candle holder and stared at the spot where the intruder had vanished. "But I don't need to see their face to know who's getting desperate. That wasn't a random prowler, Bill. That was a messenger telling us we're getting far too close to the truth." Bill shivered, pulling his hoodie tighter against the damp night air. "Whoever it is, they know we're onto the catering connection. If they're watching your house at midnight, Agatha, you aren't safe here anymore. You need to come down to the station, or at least lock yourself in." "Lock myself in?" Agatha snorted, her haughty pride immediately rushing back to fill the void of adrenaline. "I do not hide in my own home," Bill whonged. "If they want to play games, we'll play games, but we're going to play on my terms." She turned on her heel and strode back into the kitchen, her mind racing at 100 miles an hour. The pieces were no longer just scattered trivia. They were falling into a razor-sharp pattern. The pre-poisoned champagne glass, the freelance server brought in at the last minute by the family, the blackmail, the debts, and the desperate aristocratic pride of Carsley Manor. Everything pointed to a single, inescapable conclusion. Not just a motive, but an opportunity that only an insider could orchestrate. "Bill," Agatha said, turning back to the young policeman with an expression so fiercely determined, it made him take half a step backward. "How good are you at acting?" Bill blinked, bewildered. "What do you mean?" "Tomorrow morning we are going to throw a party," Agatha declared, a wicked, triumphant smile spreading across her lips. "Not a wedding reception, and certainly not a quiet cup of tea. A gathering right here in my cottage." "A party," Bill echoed, looking around the small kitchen, as if Agatha had suggested building a rocket ship to Mars. "Agatha, a man was just murdered with cyanide, and someone was literally lurking outside your window 5 minutes ago. Who on earth is going to come to a party?" "Everyone who has something to hide," Agatha said smoothly, walking over to her calendar and tapping a manicured fingernail against tomorrow's date. "We are going to invite Lord Montgomery, Clarissa, Arthur, Mrs. Gable Smith, and our trembling little bridesmaid, Chloe. We'll tell them that new forensic evidence has pinpointed the exact identity of the person who handled the champagne glass, and that the police are making an arrest tomorrow afternoon." Bill's eyes widened in sheer horror. "You can't do that. That's impersonating an official police investigation. Wilkes will suspend me, strip me of my uniform, and throw me in a holding cell." "Wilkes won't know a thing until it's over," Agatha dismissed with a wave of her hand. "Besides, you're going to hand-deliver the notes. You'll play your part as the nervous duty-bound constable who accidentally lets slip that the net is closing in on the real killer." "Agatha, this is completely insane," Bill protested, though a nervous twitch of excitement betrayed his underlying fascination. "If the murderer realizes it's a trap, you could be putting yourself in actual danger." "Danger is my middle name, Bill," Agatha lied effortlessly, though her stomach gave a tiny, nervous flutter. "Well, actually it's Mary. But that doesn't sound nearly as dramatic. Now, stop arguing, finish your tea, and listen to the plan." For the next hour, Agatha laid out every detail with the precision of a seasoned campaign manager, orchestrating a corporate coup. She wasn't going to wait for Inspector Wilkes to bumble his way through another report while the real culprit slipped away. She was going to smoke them out into the open, right in her own living room, where pride, guilt, and a well-timed bluff would force the murderer to unmask themselves. By the time Bill finally slipped out the back door into the misty Cotswold night, Agatha stood in her hallway, looking at her reflection in the mirror. Her hair was messy, her wrap was askew, but her dark eyes were blazing with the thrill of the hunt. Let them come, she thought with a grim, victorious smile. Tomorrow, the mask comes off. Chapter 10. The reveal in the Red Cottage. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Agatha's cottage, but inside, the atmosphere was thick enough to cut with a bread knife. The small living room was packed to bursting, chairs dragged in from the kitchen to accommodate the unexpected, highly reluctant influx of Castley royalty. Lord Montgomery sat stiffly in Agatha's favourite armchair, looking 10 years older and desperately out of place. Beside him, Clarissa still, wearing her engagement ring, though the wedding was now a distant, macabre memory, dabbed nervously at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Arthur Gable Smith hovered behind his new wife, like an irritable guard dog, while his mother, Mrs. Gable Smith, sat rigidly on the sofa, her face carved from stone. Across from them, Chloe Davies clutched a mug of tea so tightly, her knuckles were translucent. Standing by the fireplace, arms crossed and looking every bit the commanding hostess, was Agatha. She wore her emerald green dress once more, the very one from the wedding, as if daring the room to challenge her presence. "I don't know what kind of grotesque game you think you're playing, Mrs. Raisin," Lord Montgomery barked, his voice trembling with aristocratic outrage, "dragging us out here under the guise of police business. If this is some vulgar attempt to extort money or gain gossip for your little London circles—" "Quiet down, Montgomery," Agatha interrupted, her tone sharp, dry, and utterly merciless. "Nobody is extorting anyone. We are simply here to clear up a rather messy misunderstanding about who slipped potassium cyanide into Julian Vance's champagne glass." Mrs. Gable Smith flinched, while Arthur let out a harsh, nervous laugh. "You're barking mad. The police aren't even here. This is illegal entrapment." "Oh, the police are very much informed," Agatha lied smoothly, gesturing toward the doorway where PC Bill Wong stood awkwardly, looking as though he wished the wooden floor would swallow him whole. "And thanks to the lab report Bill managed to pull from the county coroner this morning, we know the exact mechanics of the murder." Agatha began to pace slowly across her Persian rug, her heels clicking a rhythmic, hypnotic beat against the floorboards. "Julian Vance was a parasite," Agatha said, her voice dropping into a conversational, storytelling cadence. "He discovered that Lord Montgomery was completely bankrupt, and that the marriage to the Gable Smiths was a financial transaction disguised as a fairy tale wedding. He saw an opportunity to make a fortune. He demanded £75,000 to keep quiet about past indiscretions and fake pedigrees. Mrs. Gable Smith panicked and agreed to pay him off at the wedding. Lord Montgomery was desperate. Arthur was furious. Any one of them had a motive." She stopped pacing and turned sharply, her dark eyes locking onto a specific person in the room. "But motive isn't enough," Agatha continued softly. "Julian was poisoned using a glass set aside on a private tray near the inner study doors, a tray only accessible to people working the event, or people who knew the venue inside and out. Furthermore, the coroner found traces of a very specific cosmetic powder on the rim of the glass, a high-end, lavender-scented barrier cream used by professional makeup artists and local caterers who handle sensitive skin." The room went dead silent. You could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hall. Clarissa suddenly gasped, her hands flying to her face. Agatha turned her full, unrelenting gaze upon the bride. "You didn't just hire a freelance server from Cheltenham, did you, Clarissa? Or rather, you were the freelance server for a summer during your college days before your father's money ran out. You knew how the catering staff operated. You knew how to slip past the kitchens unnoticed." Clarissa shrank back into the sofa, shaking her head violently. "No, that's insane. Why would I kill Julian? He was my ex-fiancé. I loved him. You loved his money," Agatha corrected coldly. "Until he dumped you the moment your father went broke. But when you managed to sink your hooks into wealthy Arthur Gable Smith, Julian came back. He didn't just want £50,000 anymore. He threatened to tell Arthur that you were still legally tied to him under an old betrothal contract in London, meaning your new marriage would be entirely bigamous, and the Gable Smith fortune would slip through your fingers forever." Arthur whipped his head around to stare at his new bride, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. "Clarissa, is that true?" She slipped into the cloakroom before the ceremony. Agatha pressed relentlessly, stepping closer. "Put on a spare catering apron, intercepted the welcome tray, and laced Julian's champagne with the cyanide you stole from your father's estate workshop. You welcomed him with a smile, handed him the glass, and watched him choke. "Shut up! Shut up!" Clarissa shrieked, leaping to her feet. The polished mask of aristocratic perfection shattered entirely, revealing a desperate, snarling fury. "He ruined my life. He took everything I had. And when I finally built something new, he came back to tear it down. He deserved to die." The confession hung heavy and suffocating in the cramped living room. Lord Montgomery slumped forward in his chair, burying his face in his hands with a defeated groan, while Arthur stared at his wife in sheer, unadulterated horror. P.C. Bill Wong immediately stepped forward, his face pale, and pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Clarissa Montgomery, I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Julian Vance." The rest of Bill's formal warning was drowned out by Clarissa's sudden, hysterical sobbing as he gently pulled her wrists forward. Within minutes, the cottage was a flurry of motion as backup arrived, taking the bride away while the rest of the shocked wedding party stumbled out into the afternoon sunlight. Carsley would talk about this for the next 50 years. An hour later, the cottage was finally quiet again. The police cars had gone. The aristocratic grief had departed down the lane. Agatha stood alone in her immaculate living room, pouring a very large, well-deserved glass of gin into her spaniel mug. She walked over to the window, watching the sun slowly descend over the Cotswolds. She felt a familiar twinge of loneliness, the quiet ache of an empty house. But as she took a slow, satisfying sip of her drink, a triumphant, brilliant smile spread across her face. Let the village gossip. Agatha Raisin was, once again, the undisputed Queen of Carsley. Chapter 11. The lingering smoke of Carsley. The morning sun returned to Carsley the following day with a crisp, indifferent brightness that seemed entirely unbothered by the fact that the village had just played host to a high-society murder, a black market cyanide execution, and an arrest that would comfortably occupy local gossip mills for at least the next decade. Agatha Raisin sat at her spotless kitchen table, wearing a silk dressing gown that cost more than most people's weekly groceries, sipping coffee from her favourite spaniel mug. The house was blissfully quiet. Hodge and Boswell were curled up on the rug by the back door, snoring softly in perfect synchronization. For the first time in nearly a week, there was no policeman pounding on her door, no hysterical bridesmaid crying on her sofa, and no aristocrat threatening her with legal action. The peace, however, was accompanied by that familiar, slightly hollow thud of post-crisis anticlimax. The adrenaline had faded. The mystery was solved. The headlines had been secured, and Agatha was left alone with her toast. She reached out and picked up the local county newspaper, the Gazette. Right there on the front page, in bold, glorious typeface, was the headline, "Society Wedding Murder Shock. Bride Arrested in Poison Drama." Below it was a rather unflattering photograph of Clarissa Montgomery being led into a police van, flanked by a very serious-looking Inspector Wilkes, who, predictably, had managed to work a quote into the article, praising the swift and methodical work of the local constabulary. Agatha snorted so hard, she nearly choked on her toast. "Methodical work," she muttered to the empty kitchen, tossing the paper aside. If Wilkes were any more methodical, he'd trip over his own shoelaces and arrest a lamppost. Still, as she stared at the front page, a warm glow of pride settled deep in her chest. She had done it. While the entire Carsley police force had been running around in circles looking at the wrong suspects, she had unravelled the whole sordid affair using nothing more than sharp observation, an encyclopedic knowledge of human vanity, and her own unmatched stubbornness. A sharp, crisp knock sounded at her front door. Agatha paused, her coffee mug halfway to her mouth. She frowned. If it was Inspector Wilkes coming to grudgingly thank her, she intended to shut the door right in his pompous face. If it was another weeping relative, she had run out of brandy. She stood up, smoothed down her silk gown, and walked through the hallway. She unlocked the front door and pulled it open. Standing on the porch was James Lacey. Her maddeningly handsome, permanently critical retired military neighbour looked as crisp and put together as ever in a tailored navy blazer and khaki trousers. He was holding a gardening trowel in one hand and looking slightly out of place, like a man who had walked into a war zone by accident. "Agatha," James said, his voice flat and neutral, though there was a twitch of amusement at the corner of his mouth, "I see you survived the weekend without blowing up the village." I don't blow things up, James. I merely clean them up, Agatha retorted instantly, her chin coming up a notch as her heart performed a most traitorous little flutter at the sight of him. And what brings you to my porch at 9 inches the morning? Did one of your prize-winning cabbages commit a misdemeanor? James leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. Word gets around, Agatha, even out in the lanes. The butcher was telling me that you single-handedly unmasked a murderer in your own living room yesterday afternoon, while Inspector Wilkes stood around looking like a spare part. Well, Agatha said, a smug, highly pleased smile spreading across her lips despite her best efforts to look modest. Samoan had to do it. The local constabulary has the investigative capacity of a wet cardboard box. Indeed, James murmured, though his eyes scanned her with a warm, assessing gaze that made Agatha acutely aware of her silk dressing gown and unbrushed hair. Though I'm surprised you haven't packed your bags and fled back to London yet. All this common village drama must feel terribly pedestrian after your high-flying PR days. Agatha's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, the old familiar insecurity brushing against her heart. She lived here in Carsley because she wanted peace, but she was always terrified that people viewed her as an aging, lonely interloper playing at detective because she had nothing better to do. She looked up at James, her dark eyes flashing with sudden defiance. Leave Carsley and miss the village council meeting next Tuesday when Mrs. Partridge tries to explain why the church fete budget is short £20. Not on your life, James. Someone has to keep these people honest. James chuckled, a low, genuine sound that sent an unexpected wave of warmth through Agatha's chest. He uncrossed his arms and took half a step closer. You're an impossible woman, Agatha Raisin, he said softly, his voice losing its usual sarcastic edge. I know, Agatha replied, her chin tilted high, and you wouldn't know what to do with yourself if I weren't here to irritate you. James didn't argue. He just held her gaze for a long, charged moment before offering a small, polite nod. Well, glad to see you're unharmed. If you ever decide to investigate a slightly less lethal crime, say, who's been stealing my prize runner beans, let me know. My rates are lower than yours. With that, he turned on his heel and strode back down the gravel path toward his own cottage. Agatha watched him go, a mixture of annoyance and deep, quiet satisfaction settling over her. She closed the front door, locked it, and walked back to the kitchen. The house was quiet again. The cats were still sleeping, the sun was still shining, and Agatha Raisin, dressed in her expensive silk robe, poured herself a second cup of coffee and smiled. Carsley was back to normal, which meant it was safe, predictable, and desperately in need of her. Chapter 12. The village fates and other casualties. 2 weeks had passed since the Carsley Manor wedding murder, and village life had snapped back into its customary, rhythmically petty groove. The shock of Clarissa Montgomery's arrest had provided endless conversational fodder over garden fences, at the post office, and during the weekly meetings of the Carsley Ladies' Society, but time in the Cotswolds moved with a stubborn, bovine indifference. Scandal was wonderful, but the arrival of the annual parish summer fete was practically a matter of life and death. Agatha Raisin stood in the centre of the village green, surveying the chaos of striped canvas tents, bunting, and folding tables with a critical eye. As a prominent local resident and someone who had recently saved the county from a rather embarrassing judicial catastrophe, she had naturally been ganged into running the tombola stall. She wore a breezy canary yellow summer dress that she hoped conveyed effortless chic, though a matching straw boater hat was currently threatening to take flight in the brisk afternoon breeze. Agatha, do stop glaring at the stuffed animals. You're frightening the children, chirped Mrs. Bloxby, strolling past with an armload of homemade jam jars. The vicar's wife looked as serene as ever, offering a warm, knowing smile that suggested she knew far more about Agatha's private thoughts than was strictly comfortable. I'm not glaring at the stuffed animals, Mrs. Bloxby. I'm glaring at Colonel Proctor, who has spent the last 20 minutes trying to rig the ring toss game, Agatha snapped, though she adjusted her hat with a good-natured huff. Honestly, if men aren't committing murder, they're cheating at carnival games. It's a wonder civilization has survived this long. Mrs. Bloxby chuckled softly. Well, you certainly brought plenty of excitement to Carsley this month. The police haven't looked this bewildered since the sheep rustling incident of '98. Inspector Wilkes was heard at the pub last night, muttering something about recommending you for an honorary constable badge. Over my dead body, Agatha said, with genuine horror. I look terrible in navy blue, and their hats are completely unstylish. With a polite nod, Mrs. Blocksby continued down the row of stalls, leaving Agatha to her domain of unwanted brick, a brack half-empty perfume gift sets, and slightly stale boxes of shortbread. The green was packed. Families strolled between the stalls, children chased each other with sticky cotton candy, and the local brass band was mangling a jaunty march that sounded suspiciously like a funeral dirge. Agatha scanned the crowd, her sharp eyes darting from face to face. She spotted Lord Montgomery, looking remarkably dignified despite his financial ruin, chatting politely near the tea tent, as if his daughter hadn't just been carted off to a prison-holding cell. She saw Mrs. Gable Smith drifting through the edges of the crowd, avoiding eye contact with almost everyone, her social standing reduced to a smouldering ruin. And, much to her irritation, she spotted James Lacey standing near the bookstall, pretending to examine a battered copy of Fly Fishing in the Cotswolds, while occasionally glancing in her direction. Agatha's heart gave that familiar, traitorous flutter. She smoothed down the skirt of her canary yellow dress, assuming an expression of severe, aristocratic indifference. Before James could make a move toward her, a familiar figure pushed through the crowd of villagers, wearing a crisp police constable uniform and carrying a large plastic wrapped tray of prize, winning lemon drizzle cake. Afternoon, Agatha, P.C. Bill, Wong said cheerfully, resting the cake on the edge of the tombola table. Bill, Agatha said, raising an eyebrow. Is that an official police bribe, or did you bake that yourself? My mum baked it, Bill grinned, wiping his brow. She wanted to thank you properly for not getting me fired during your little unscheduled interrogation seminar at your cottage 2 weeks ago. Apparently, Inspector Wilkes officially closed the case yesterday. Clarissa's trial date is set for autumn. Good, Agatha said firmly, crossing her arms. Justice served, and my Persian rug is almost entirely free of brandy stains, though I must say village life is getting dreadfully quiet again. Bill, almost boring. Bill let out a hearty laugh. Careful what you wish for, Agatha. You say that now, but the autumn bulb planting competition is only 3 months away, and Mrs. Partridge has already been making vague, threatening remarks about her daffodils. Agatha rolled her eyes, though a genuine, mischievous smile played at the corners of her mouth. Daffodils, is it? Well, if anyone tampers with her bulbs, she knows who to call. As Bill wandered off toward the coconut shy, a shadow fell over the tombola table. Agatha looked up. James Lacey stood there, his hands tucked casually into his trouser pockets, looking down at her with that half-mocking, half-admiring expression that drove her completely crazy. I see you've abandoned detective work for the more dangerous world of amateur tombolas, James remarked, nodding toward a shelf of dusty ceramic cats. Someone has to maintain standards in this village, James, since you clearly spend all your time looking at old fishing books. Agatha retorted smoothly, her dark eyes sparkling. Are you going to buy a raffle ticket, or did you just walk over here to criticize my hat? James smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his handsome, stern face entirely. I came to see if a certain impossible woman might like to get away from all this village noise and grab a rather decent cup of coffee at the tea room. My treat. Agatha paused, her pride warring deliciously with the sudden warm rush of pleasure in her chest. She looked out over the crowded green, the bright bunting snapping in the wind, and then back at James. She reached up, adjusted her straw boater hat with absolute defiant confidence, and stepped out from behind the tombola table. Well, Agatha said, linking her arm smoothly through his with a victorious grin, I suppose the tombola can survive without me for 20 minutes. Lead the way, James. As they walked together through the sunlit Cotswold village, the music played on, the gossip swirled, and Agatha Raisin felt entirely, wonderfully at home.